Can you explain Matthew 11, verse 12? Matthew 11, verse 12. So go ahead and turn there with me. We're going to take a look at Matthew chapter 11 and verse 12. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. So I believe what the questioner is asking is, how is it that the kingdom of heaven suffers violence? What exactly does that mean? Let's start by going to Luke 16. Luke 16. And to give you an idea of where we're going with this, when Matthew 11 describes the kingdom of heaven as suffering violence, what it's a description of, it's a description of the violence, of the persecution that is directed against the kingdom church. And so I'll show that to you. Start in Luke 16, verse 16. Luke 16, 16. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presseth into it. So Luke 16 is a very helpful verse in terms of dispensational timing. It says the law and prophets were until John. So prior to John the Baptist, what information was preached? Well, it obviously would have been the Old Testament law of Moses, and it would have been the prophets in the Old Testament. That which was preached from Exodus all the way up through Matthew was the law and the prophets. But when John the Baptist was called, what did John the Baptist then teach? Well, he preached the gospel of the kingdom. So if you look at Luke 16, 16, it makes sense. The law and the prophets were until John. That's exactly what we would expect. Since that time, the kingdom of God is preached. So the kingdom of God began to be preached with John the Baptist. And then what the verse says, and every man presseth into it. So once the gospel of the kingdom starts to be preached, then people respond to it, press into the kingdom. Get with me Luke 12. Luke chapter 12. Luke 12, verse 32. Fear not, little flock, for it is the Father's good pleasure to give unto you the kingdom. What Luke 12:32 indicates is that what God is going to do is he's going to give the kingdom to the little flock. In other words, the kingdom will not be given to the nation of Israel as a whole, because much of the nation of Israel was in unbelief. So the kingdom will be taken away from the apostate leadership of Israel, the unbelieving leadership of Israel, and it will be given to the little flock. Get with me Matthew chapter 10. So we understand that what's happening during the Gospels is the kingdom is preached, beginning at John, and when people believe the kingdom message, they press into the kingdom. The Lord calls that the little flock because he's going to give the kingdom to that little flock, not the unbelieving nation as a whole. Now, if you'll notice what happens in Matthew 10, the little flock is going to face opposition. Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils, and they will scourge you in their synagogues. Well, that counts as violence. Look at verse 21. And the brother shall deliver up the brother to death, and the father the child. And the children shall rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. But he that endureth to the end shall be saved. So what did the little flock face? Well, the little flock faced what believers throughout time have faced. They faced opposition, they faced persecution, they faced violence. Now, when you think about the little flock suffering violence, or when you think about the kingdom of heaven suffering violence, there might be one event that just pops to the forefront of your mind. And if you would, get with me Mark 6. Mark 6. Now think about this with me just for a minute. What Matthew 11 said is it said the kingdom of heaven suffered violence. We know from Luke 16, the law and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of God is preached. So the kingdom of God began to be preached with John, and the kingdom suffers violence. So the best example of the kingdom of heaven suffering violence is going to be who? John the Baptist. So look with me at Mark 6. Mark chapter 6, verse 21. And when a convenient day was come, that Herod on his birthday made a supper to his lords, high captains, and chief estates of Galilee. And when the daughter of the said Herodias came in and danced, and pleased Herod, and them that sat with him, the king said unto the damsel, Ask of me whatsoever thou wilt, and I will give it thee. And he sware unto her, Whatsoever thou shalt ask of me, I will give it thee, unto the half of my kingdom. A rash statement that he probably shouldn't have made. And she went forth and said unto her mother, What shall I ask? And she said, The head of John the Baptist. And she came in straightway with haste unto the king, and asked, saying, I will that thou give me by and by in a charger the head of John the Baptist. And the king was exceeding sorry, yet for his oath's sake, and for their sakes which sat with him, he would not reject her. He should have just told her no, obviously. And immediately the king sent an executioner, and commanded his head to be brought, and he went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head in a charger, and gave it to the damsel, and the damsel gave it to her mother. And when his disciples heard of it, they came and took up his corpse, and laid it in a tomb. So that's obviously an example of the kingdom of heaven suffering violence, where John the Baptist is put to death. So Matthew 11, verse 21, when it talks about the kingdom of heaven suffering violence, it's simply a reference to the fact that the little flock, the kingdom church, suffered great violence and opposition.